I talk for a second?
Excursion into
Coaching. Here we are, talking about coaching. My name is Yannick, and I'm sitting here with Sasha. Sasha Smith is on your screen. Sasha van Deurzen Smith, I hear sometimes.
Yes.
What do you go by these days?
At the moment, professionally, Van Deurzen Smith, just because people citing Smith is a pain. It's just, you don't know who it is.
Yeah, also citing Van Deurzen in the name is probably useful, I would think.
For sure.
Well, we have a lot. There's a lot about you. There's a lot about me and us in relationship. First, maybe I just want to say that talking about coaching, this is the deep dive, that I love to do with people that I find really interesting, and I love talking about coaching. So that's really what it says on the tin. I have a whole page of questions for Sasha. We've known each other for 10 years now. Can you believe it's been 10 years since since we did our MA in existential coaching together? Time seems to have been flying past. And this conversation to really deep dive into some of this existential coaching stuff has been long overdue, because we've trained together. I think we were the two only existential coaches with an MA at some point in the world.
That's right. We were the first two. Yeah.
So there were other students on the course, but they graduated later or chose not to do the piece of research, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so we have quite a bit of a history. We have a lot in common. We both started teaching this stuff. You took over the MA in existential coaching, where I come in occasionally to teach a module, and I've taught it at Animas, and then you came over to take over the weekend in existential coaching, while I focused on the positive psychology stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of overlap, but also I'm sure a lot of how we approach existential coaching differently ourselves, because there's such a range. So that's kind of what I want to explore a bit, give existential coaching some airplay, but also dig a little bit deeper into what it is and just showcase your attitude towards it, meeting my attitude towards it. We have a lot in common. I'm sure we have some differences, and it'll be an exciting conversation.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. But first, maybe to give a bit of context on where you are coming from and who you are. I mentioned some of the professional roles that you've had, a lot of existential coach training. You've done a lot of work in the autism, LGBTQ plus kind of communities.
Yeah.
You've gone into politics at some point. You were quite active, I've seen. So could you give people a bit of context on who are you? The small question. Sure.
Yes. Well, I think probably an important contextual part of who I am is, kind of what we were talking about in terms of names. So Van Deurzen might be a familiar name to some people, and that's because my mother is very well known in the field of existential psychotherapy. So my sort of teenage rebellion was saying, I am not going to have anything to do with psychology, psychotherapy, philosophy, anything that begins with a P, basically. And obviously that didn't quite work out in the way that I had intended fully. But for me, coaching, existential coaching specifically, was a way of kind of getting involved in that world in a context that I find really exciting and interesting. That is the kind of more dynamic, practical side of the coaching, but still with that philosophical depth, and taking a lot from the psychotherapy literature and obviously from the philosophy. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I came from originally as a practitioner. And then I got interested in working, as you said, with autistic adults, whether they're self-diagnosed or formally diagnosed, and just finding that existential coaching was a really, really great way of working with that client group. But also, I am autistic myself. Mm-hmm. So I think important to nurture those autism-friendly environments. And similarly with the LGBTQ stuff, and actually mixing those two, because there's a very high prevalence, particularly of gender nonconformity within people with an autism spectrum disorder. So Really nice overlap there in terms of intersectionality, diversity.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
And,
I really love
politics.
First of all, I really love the term neurodiversity, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. I think it's good to have a word that, you know, it doesn't sound like you're putting people in a massive box or playing them down or looking at it as some sort of disability.
Absolutely, yeah. Huge existential theme there as well, hey? Not boxing people up.
Yeah, and talking about big existential themes, politics, absurdity.
Yeah, very much that. Very much that. Yeah, I don't really know where that stuff came from. I just felt compelled at a certain point to get involved in local politics, local party politics, and ran as a counsellor. Didn't get in, which was probably for the best. I mean, my workload certainly would have been a lot higher. But yeah, I don't know. I guess that's in some way that's linked to my interest in coaching, because there's something there for me around meaning, I guess, and the way that we create meaning and the way that we seek out meaningful activities. Politics was just kind of another way of doing that.
Yeah, and the people I know who are or went into politics at some point, what struck me was there was a big pull, like they tended to feel a calling towards making an impact, making some positive difference,
yes.
And not just creating meaning in their lives and other people's through that, but it's that taking of responsibility of,
yes.
you know, going. Maybe that's the German in me, the proper channels to induce change, you know, getting the people on board and going the more traditional way of making a difference, you know?
Yeah, I think that's right. And there was something around empowerment, I think, and because within politics, there are people who engage with it. The people who engage with it, I think, are quite a small minority. That perhaps has changed in the last few years in this particular country. I'm not sure, but there was something for me around showing people that everybody has a political position, whether or not they realize it, and that there are things that you can do in order to make that heard and to have some kind of input, some kind of say, some kind of self-actualization. Unfortunately, it's really hard to persuade people of that when you're perceived as part of the system. So that's the kind of paradox of it. You get into it to kind of have that impact, or to get people excited, or get people talking and engaged. But actually, as soon as you become a representative, people are less inclined to listen to you in a funny way. It's a strange phenomenon.
There's a lot of stigma involved in that system.
For sure.
Yeah, I've been revisiting Peter Hawkins and Eve Turner's systemic coaching lately, because he's doing a module for us, and I've been re-diving into it. And one of the things he said is that you, as a coach, you never coach individuals, and you're not the one doing the coaching. You know, that as a statement was like, this is amazing. But like, I think it's so important for us, especially coaches, to realize that we're always existing in a system of sorts, you know, whether that's a political system or the ecosystem or the family or the organization. And politics is one of those avenues to start changing or asserting influence in a system. And for years when I was younger, like up until in my 20s at some point, I was like, I'm not interested in politics. Yeah. But everybody's interested in politics. Everybody's a political person, as you say, what has triggered that. So I think it's commendable that some people actually try and change it from, you know, within the system, but difficult to hold those two different systems and where it clashes.
Yeah, absolutely. Really difficult. And I think a really weird, paradoxical awareness of, I guess, the level of engagement of people. So realizing in some ways losing a lot of faith in humanity, in some ways gaining a lot of faith in humanity. So, you know, seeing the people who are out there who are doing so much, who are kind of unsung heroes that you really get to come in contact when you're sort of engaged in that political realm. You come across some really, really amazing people who you just never would have heard about, who are so inspiring. But then also being faced with, I guess, the more majority attitude of people who are just very angry about things, you know, and rightly so. It's not that they're in the wrong, but nobody's kind of shown them what to do with that anger, or how that can be used in a positive way, or that people might listen to that, or, you know, that there's something that they can do with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is where, I mean, I grew up with hip hop, and one of my pieces of research when I went, you know, into academia was researching what motivated people to get into, you know, emceeing or writing lyrics, into but beyond that, breakdancing and writing graffiti, and you know, all of the elements of hip hop. And what I found, one of the motivations behind it was to have a voice. You know, and I think politics is one way to have a voice. Writing lyrics, putting things out there is a way to have a voice. Writing something on the wall for people to see is a way to have a voice. You know, let's leave the legalities of this out of it. But like, I think having a voice and finding that voice and finding a way to express an authentic voice is so important. And I think that, you know, it's in the middle of the existential sphere, but finding a way where that's authentic. I admire people who go into politics. I think I would find it very difficult to be really authentic in the political system as it exists now. Yeah. And I think helping particularly clients, but I think people in general, to find an authentic way to have a political voice, and that political voice to be accepted and engaged with, is not seen so much when somebody writes something on the wall, but it's seen a lot more when somebody goes into politics, so to speak.
Well, and I think this is really important going forward anyway, because more and more you see sort of scandals around young politicians who have a whole history on social media. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of inescapable now. We're coming to a point where the next generations of politicians and political activists are all going to have things that are available for people to see that maybe they wouldn't like people to see. And, you know, I'm not necessarily talking about really scandalous things where people have sort of, you know, atrocious views that they've expressed. Where
we're not talking blackface, we're talking about getting drunk at a party.
Exactly. So I think we are going to have to completely adjust our ideas of you know, what a politician is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I see that more and more, that people, particularly I'm talking clients, because, you know, we're talking coaching context, where they want to have a voice, they want to make a difference, they want to assert some kind of influence, but they feel kind of paralyzed by the system being so overwhelmingly not changing in that regard. And so people lose hope, you know, to, well, what difference is my voice going to make? And that's why I think it's so important to encourage people to go have a voice and express it, you know? Definitely.
And it's that kind of Nietzschean idea, I think, of, you know, how difficult it is actually to go against the herd, to go against the grain, and to make yourself known in terms of who you actually are, what you actually think, especially when that goes quite against the culture of the particular group that you're in, or particular groups that you're in. It's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, no, this is great. I wanted to talk about Nietzsche anyway, because I know you're a fan, and I know many people who are. I think that going against the herd is such an important thing, because it takes so much courage to be challenging. You know, Nietzsche was very, very challenging. He wrote a lot of very challenging stuff. Maybe let's talk about the early to mid Nietzsche and not the late Nietzsche for now. But it takes courage to say something. I watched that Jordan Peterson clip with Kathy Newman, the reporter, and something he said. I mean, we could talk about Jordan Peterson a lot, but something he said I think was really powerful, which is if you didn't want to offend anybody, if you didn't want to go against people in some way or say something that somebody might take the wrong way, we couldn't speak at all. I think every time we open our mouth, every time we do something, anytime a client walks out the door, being dressed in whatever way it might be, it will go against somebody. Going against a whole herd, there's a definition of, the majority or the people. But I think generally having the courage to say what you think when it's not perceived as acceptable, perhaps, or slightly challenging. I think it's so important to challenge, because that's how we can grow knowledge. That's how we can develop. But it does take courage, because we're such social animals.
Yeah, it does. It does.
How do you work with clients to develop that kind of courage?
Oh gosh, well, I think a lot of it is about self-knowledge. It's very difficult to put ourselves out there if we don't sort of trust that internal compass. And we've kind of all been taught not to trust it. We've all been taught to go along with those various groups that we're a part of. And to some degree, we have to. It's not about completely shunning everything. And it's not about, I think sometimes people take this approach of, well, it's okay if I say whatever I want to because I'm just being honest, which I think is actually a really, really profoundly dangerous attitude. But there is something about being able to actually understand where we're coming from in order to be able to express that in a way that is appropriate, shall we say. I'm very conscious of the fact that you mentioned Jordan Peterson, and I have such an issue with him, particularly as somebody who identifies as non-binary. So I'm trying to push that down slightly for the conversation, but I can feel it creeping out in my in my exploration here of this particular issue.
We've got plenty of time. We can dive into it a little bit.
But yes, I think it's about creating that space where people can sit with themselves and reveal whatever they feel comfortable revealing, both to me as a practitioner, but in a way more so to themselves. All those bits that they're scared to look at, all those bits that they're scared to be judged for, and being able to hold that non-judgmental space where those things are not so taboo, even if they're things that, I might have a really profound disagreement on. So quite often politics will come into it. And it might be that they're expressing something that's very, very different to my own political opinion, but it's about being able to give that space that it's okay that we can own our opinions and we don't have to agree on everything. That's not the point of the dialogue. It's about them being able to explore and own their own perspective. And then the next step is to think about how that goes out into the world. But unless we do that work first, we can't do the next bit authentically.
So first we need to know where we're coming from and develop a sense of self in a way before we can go out and actually challenge from a place of confidence.
Yeah, and that sense of self is complex as well, and it's paradoxical. And I think a lot of it is about encouraging people to sit with their own ambiguity, their own complex feelings, the things about themselves that perhaps they don't like, and also the positives and negatives of all of those bits of themselves that they're aware of. It's that kind of wholeness of being, I suppose, that sense of you and I and everybody else as a fully formed person that isn't simple and that can't be boxed up.
Yeah, and I think this is where we are in the heart of existential coaching, right? Because we're asking about somebody's foundations, somebody's core, somebody's self, somebody's sense of identity. Yeah. Who are you is such an important question to explore in order to have that, I want to say safe haven to go out into the world from, but it's actually not as safe because it's made up of all of these dilemmas and paradoxes, and it's really difficult to sit with that. It's a courageous act in itself to be open to the idea and explore the idea that, we have these paradoxes inside of us and they're just not going to go away just because we are alive and human beings in a world with other human beings.
Yeah.
You know, it's difficult to be that.
Yeah, and it might not ever get to a place where you feel sort of safe in doing that. The likelihood is that it is always going to be an act of courage, and by that we mean we're always going to be anxious about it, and because, you know, courage is acting in the face of that fear, the face of that anxiety, rather than not having it at all. And I think there's this kind of cultural pressure that, firstly, that if something is right, that we'll just know it and it will kind of bolster us and make us suddenly comfortable with the situation. But actually, that's very rarely the case. So I think something around that, being able to sit with the knowledge that doing that is always going to be uncomfortable. Putting yourself out there in your complexity is going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's a part of the deal. That's what you sacrifice in order to be able to present yourself to the world.
Yeah. So how do you respond when a client, for example, points you to all of these people on Instagram or Facebook, or perhaps people that they know, and they say, but those people, they're not scared. You know, I see them out all the time, and you know, Sasha's on this podcast and she seems super confident. Yeah? You know, I've seen this person and that person, and they're like born leaders. And look at Steve Jobs; he's never scared. And I mean, I welcome the trend that, you know, Brené Brown was a big part of that. I think that people, especially people in leadership positions and people in positions of responsibility and visible people, like there is a trend that they become more vulnerable. They show more of their humanness, you know, and we can see that. And I think people have responded super well to other people's vulnerability, you know, other people's humanness. But there's still a lot of people who seem to think that this ideal of never being anxious and always being confident actually exists. You know, when that comes up, how do you respond to that when you're a coach?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think a lot of the time I do share something, which is that when I first started coaching, the one common thread across all of my clients, and I think this has remained true to this day, was that they're all just bloody horrible to themselves and you know, don't treat themselves very well. Their self-talk is poor. They're constantly anxious about stuff. It's like we're all messes. We're all total messes. It's just such a myth that anybody has it sussed out to that degree. And if we could all be a bit more open and honest about that, I think probably mental health issues would go down drastically, because we wouldn't feel like we were the defective ones.
Yeah, especially in this day and age where everybody seems to be very visible. You know, we can have a look into other people's lives, and some are very transparent and authentic and vulnerable in it. And a lot of others just put their best version out. And I've put certain pictures out and not others, you know. I don't necessarily want to share with everybody when I'm feeling vulnerable and fragile, you know. So I think, but it's happening more and more, and that's really useful, you know.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think, a bit more of that kind of transparency is really helpful. But I take your point, you know, given the choice, you're going to put out the picture that's better. But also, I think credit to certain people out there who have been putting themselves in extremely vulnerable positions in order to flout that. So people who have, you know, celebrities who refused permission for people to Photoshop them, for example, or deliberately putting out pictures with no makeup and no filters or Photoshop, you know, people who do that genuinely. It's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to start actually with a question, and I wonder what you would say to somebody at a dinner party who asks you, what do you do for a living? You know, people ask, what do you do? I mean, often they really ask, who are you? But like, I wonder how you describe yourself as a coach to somebody who may not know what coaching is. So if somebody says, hey, what do you do for a living? And you wanted to put your coaching work out there, what would you say?
Yeah, I always find that really difficult. And I think I kind of tailor it according to the person slightly. But the things that I'm likely to say are I use philosophy to help people to live their lives in a more fulfilling way. Mm-hmm. Or I help people to claim their complexity. I prefer that personally, because to me,
their complexity. I really like that. Because there's an active, it's an activity, right? It's a claiming of complexity.
That's it. And to me, that's the goal in coaching. It's not, you can have targets, and I'm not anti that. That's fantastic. And to a large degree, that's the expectation when you come to coaching. But the main target, I think, is about that claiming, claiming our ambiguity.
Although I could imagine some blank looks if you tell people that you're helping people claim their complexity.
I've kind of just decided that I'm going to get blank looks, whatever. So I may as well say something that feels right.
And how do you bring the coaching element in? Because, using philosophy, helping people to claim their complexity could be done in many different ways, right? Mm-hmm. What is it about coaching, and particularly existential coaching, that helps people do that?
Yeah, I think it's that it's something about the sort of thrust of it, the dynamic of it, that it's a profoundly forward-moving approach. So we're not although we're looking at past and present and that existential notion of eternity as another kind of time setting, it is very much driven towards that future. So we're always checking in, we're always seeing where it is that people want to get to, and that's what informs the work, rather than something like trauma or distress or something on that more psychotherapeutic end being the thing that informs the work.
Say a bit more about infinity or eternity.
Yeah, it's just one of those things when we talk about temporality, we tend to just think of past, present, future as the kind of realms that we live in or inhabit, or, however it is that you conceive of that. But existentialists like to talk about eternity as well as another thing. So there are various things that we think of in these kind of eternal terms, this sense of infinity that we will ascribe to things, but we forget that when we talk about temporality. Mm-hmm. So a lot of tongue-tied. A lot of the time...
We haven't even gotten to Phenomenological yet.
Oh, God, don't even.
I still get that sometimes.
Oh, yeah. It's a real test of how confident you're feeling. So things around belief and meaning making are kind of the obvious things that we ascribe this sense of infinity to. So obviously people who have a religious faith, there is that sense of infinity kind of embedded in the whole dialogue around that. But we don't have to be religious in order to relate to that or experience that or ascribe that quality to something.
Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking, I'm often... I'm trying to put myself into the shoes of somebody who's not knee deep in the philosophy. And they might think something like, well, but existentialists, aren't they all talking about how we're all going to die and that we're only we're being thrown into this world? I mean, this is an advanced novice, isn't death a thing? I mean, you're talking about infinity and eternity. That seems to be a lot further than, my own death.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. You just reminded me of something, and I have to throw it out there, that you were talking about the advanced novice, and I was thinking about the most basic novice that I've ever heard of when it comes to existential thought. And it was our colleague on the course said that somebody had asked, so Phil I'm talking about, somebody had asked him, existentialism, isn't that when you cast an evil spirit out of someone? They were mixing it up with exorcism.
Oh my God. Yeah, well, it's got its parallels, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, it's true. We are talking about death a lot. But I think there is an assumption that in talking about some of these more difficult aspects of being human, that will somehow make things more difficult for us, like claiming the difficult aspects of being alive will somehow make our experiences more difficult. And actually, it's a really empowering thing to be able to do. And it doesn't need to be a kind of nihilistic, depressing experience.
Mm-hmm.
It actually, when we sort of grab hold of those things and work with them rather than feeling that they're working against us, that's so freeing.
Mm. Could you give an example? Because I'm always trying to make the complex, convoluted, sometimes philosophy relate to what's actually showing up for people, both in the coaching room with clients. Other coaches will be listening to this predominantly, I reckon. But like, how does it show up?
Well, I think all of the stuff around freedom and choice is a really good example, because I guess people are slightly more open to those concepts. Like freedom is a sexier word than responsibility. So let's start there. This existential theme that Sasha was particularly keen on around the fact that we live in what he deemed bad faith. So the denial of our freedom, the denial of the choices that we have. And this is not a sort of blue sky thinking idea of, anything is possible. It's not that at all. It's within the boundaries that you have. And I think this is something, as he said, this is something that we all do. We all deny our freedom. We all deny the choices that we have. And actually, when you claim that freedom and the fact that you are denying that freedom, you are denying a whole host of choices that you just haven't considered, because it's easier not to look at all of the information, and we have to limit it to a degree. Mm-hmm. But B, because freedom is scary. Freedom is profoundly scary, even though it is the sexier word. We're denying it because if we realize all of the possibilities that we have to choose from, we have to think about all of the potential consequences of those choices and all of the paths that we're closing off when we make those choices. So we often choose not to choose.
Yeah, it's like me at the end of school thinking, oh my God, I have like a gazillion different choices of who I will want to be. It's not just what am I going to study, but like what kind of person do I want to be, and what kind of job do I want to do, or what kind of people do I want to help, or what do I want my day to look like, or my lifestyle to feel like, and then crafting a path that somehow gets there, and at the same time, we're the generation that didn't grow up with the internet, but then it came around, so now you go on YouTube or you go on social media or, whatever, you start exploring what I could be. And then there's all of these options, and even if you narrow it down massively by, I want to do something that helps people through talking, there used to be maybe 3 people that do that you have access to. And then, you probably get trained by one of them. Nowadays, you go on the internet and there's like a gazillion different approaches just to life coaching, and so it can be nauseating to have that kind of, to be faced with that kind of possibility and having to make a choice, the right one, the best one. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a lot of the time my clients tend to come from a place of stuckness. There's a feeling of, I want to move forward towards something, and that the something might not be clear, or it might be very clear. But there's a sense of somehow being rooted or bamboozled, or just not feeling that sense of potential forward movement for whatever reason. There's a sense of stuckness. And I think a lot of that is either about that dizziness of freedom, that feeling of, oh my goodness, that the moment that I choose this is the moment that I'm shutting off all sorts of other possibilities, or, I'm I'm trying to think of the right phrase. I'm really, really bad at those like British set phrases because like neither of my parents are British. So I'm going to not go that route because I'll get the phrase wrong.
The early bird catches the storm.
The other day I said something like, oh, you have to keep that one under your shirt. I meant hat. It just doesn't work as well.
Yeah, no, I'm the same. As a German coming in the other day, somebody asked me, "What, you don't know what this is or what that is?" Stephen Fry had this show called Quite Interesting, or like QI, I think it was.
Yeah.
And it's like massive. And I was sitting there with a couple of my friends, and they literally couldn't believe that I had never heard of it. Anyway. So, I mean, I'm always, again, I'm trying to make this more tangible so coaches will actually know how these kind of things show up. Why is the philosophy relevant? And I think making choices, I mean, I've had that in my 20s at some point. I lived quite carefree, which was nice. I was really lovely to not think ahead and plan so much. I didn't have a 5-year plan or a 3-year vision or a 10-year what kind of legacy I want to leave. I just kind of going with the flow. I called myself a dynamic drifter. I kind of, it's not that I just drifting aimlessly. I knew this personal development. I was studying positive psychology at the time. I knew this coaching thing was really interesting. That's going to work out sometime, but I wasn't really setting goals and working towards them in a structured, strategic manner.
Yeah.
But that also meant I didn't have to commit, to anything in particular. That's why in large ways I was so carefree. And I see that a lot from people that are kind of drifting along with the currents, possibilities come along and there's people say yes or no to them. And what happened to me because of that is I was never really proud of anything that I've achieved, because I didn't really feel that I was making it happen. Through the work with my own existential coach, I had to give myself a lot more credit for how things and opportunities arose. But for me, very much it felt like I was just kind of going with the flow and saying yes to things that kind of swept my way. Far away from the motorway, getting somewhere, very much on the scenic route and doing a lot of detours, potentially driving in a few circles here and there.
Yeah.
And I think it was really difficult for me to decide that's what I want to do. And that's how I'm going to make it happen. Because doing that would mean now I can fail, and now things can go differently to what I had expected them to be. And that's disappointing. So I think that happens a lot with people and a lot with clients, especially when they feel stuck, unable to make those decisions.
Absolutely. And on the other end of the spectrum as well, of that feeling of kind of almost being crushed by responsibility or what we perceive our responsibility to be, or the responsibility that other people have ascribed to us. I mean, I think that to kind of compare in terms of personal experience, I guess that's more where historically I found myself until fairly recently, I would say, really actually tackling that. And, equally you tie yourself in knots on that end, which is, again, still that denial of owning a choice. There's this feeling of, okay, well, I'm just going to do, what people expect me to do, and denying that there's a choice in that, when what we actually mean is I don't like the idea of the particular consequences of that. So I'm just going to completely eradicate the entire idea from my consciousness, rather than sitting with the uncomfortability of that and actually taking it out and having a look at it and think, okay, well, what would it be like if I didn't meet this expectation? What would it be like if I did something unexpected? And I think, again, it's about having that safe space to do that, and knowing that just because we're thinking on those terms, it doesn't mean that we then have to go and action it. It's literally just having a moment to play with the possibilities.
Yeah, and there we're talking about bad faith, right? And this is the other spectrum of the stuckness. It's like, because responsibility can be laid onto somebody. Existentialists often like to say, well, responsibility is something that you take, it's something that you accept. But so many people find themselves in situations where responsibility has been placed upon them. I have that a lot with oldest siblings, for example. You know, there seems to be so much pressure because of certain ideas around what I'm supposed to do. And these messages exist not just for firstborns, but, you know, in general, any kind of environment that we're in, society wants us to be in a certain way. Our parents want us to be in a certain way. Our friends want us to be in a certain way. And we can feel responsible to them, you know, depending on the extent of which we respect them or accept their authority. Yeah. And so that can be crippling, you know. But underneath that, we do have a choice. We have the choice to accept or reject that responsibility. And how we relate to it can be a really challenging way to navigate.
Absolutely. And there's something about breaking that cycle as well that you were describing, that, you know, because if you're somebody who doesn't put the boundaries that far out, so somebody who has that kind of mushy, porous boundary in terms of what other people can expect of you, then people will work on that assumption. So you kind of tell people how you are to be treated. And to be able to break that, I think, again, you have to be in that place where you're so sure that that's the right thing for you to do, that you're able to face all of those consequences of it, because people don't like that. People don't like it when suddenly they can't count on you to do the thing that they've counted on you to do for years and years and years. That might be an inappropriate thing, you know.
Yeah, and also for the individual, it's really difficult because the act of questioning is a courageous act, you know, because what if I allowed myself to question my parents or my bosses or societies or, you know, authority or my responsibility, and all of a sudden all of this choice opens up, you know. So now I have to choose because I know I can. It can be, in a way, paradoxically, it can be much more comfortable to be uncomfortable, not having a choice, than to have all of this choice opening up. But now I choose and I must accept the responsibility.
That's it. And I think that's such a big part of existential work, isn't it? It's that really understanding all of the different things that are at play and those choices that people are making. So what is it that they're gaining from that? They might have a narrative about it that seems awful, distressing, upsetting, you know, and you would think, well, why wouldn't they just change that, because it's obviously causing them so much pain. But there's always a payoff, there's always a reason that that's being done, whether it's because they it's a part of their identity to be seen as that sort of helpful person, maybe, or that more subservient person, or whether it is simply about an attitude to conflict, or, you know, there's so many different reasons why we find ourselves in these situations, but we tend to stick to a particular narrative about it, and there's something about that breaking out of that narrative and really understanding what's going on, or all the various currents that are directing this.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most powerful questions that I often ask, that keeps coming back, is to ask people, how is this situation serving you? You know, how's this being stuck, or being in this relationship, or being in whatever state of discomfort or something they want to change? And being in that serves them to some degree, usually, you know, and asking, inquiring, exploring, in what way does it serve them? Not assuming sometimes it doesn't, you know, and then it's just kind of a no-brainer to move away from it. But often the reason that they need help with moving away from something, or a version of themselves, or some sort of environment, is that does fulfill some sort of service. You know, it is useful in some way or another.
Yeah, and actually sometimes this is why I kind of this is why I prefer the focus on claiming complexity rather than necessarily about this kind of more concrete goal-driven work, is that often when people look at that, the goal might change in an instant, because if you get in tune, in touch with the reason why you are putting yourself in that situation, what the payoff is, how it serves you, sometimes people go, oh, actually, yeah, I kind of want that to stay the way it is. I've changed my mind. Like, it's because we are that complex. It's never that straightforward.
Yeah, but I think that's why we can start with a goal. And I think goals are probably a good thing to talk about as well, because I find it in my existential work more that people start the work without a concrete goal to work towards. But I also find that when somebody comes in with a very concrete, very smart or smarter goal, very defined, very measurable, very, seemingly achievable, once you start exploring what that goal is, but particularly what that goal means to them, then you start opening some of that existential space. And I think this is why the existential perspective on whatever kind of coaching you are doing, I don't expect anybody to become an existential coach after the training, but I think it elevates everybody's perspective on coaching, because you start exploring some of the meanings of the goal before you jump straight in.
Yeah.
And I think that can open so many valuable doors. Sometimes the goal changes, sometimes it doesn't, but it always gets more grounded.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Something around ownership.
I have that conversation a couple of times of some people would say, well, it is not coaching without a goal, or without at least a direction or an agenda or something that you can kind of point to and say, that's what I want to get out of the work. I've had a few clients where we agreed we would have existential conversations, because usually what I say to a coaching client is, look, if you create a very smart goal and very well defined and measurable and all of that stuff, then I can be confident that we can work towards that goal and get results quite quickly, because the whole conversation is focused on achieving that kind of outcome. We always know where the anchor point is. But I'm comfortable not having that and starting the conversations, because I know something will emerge, not just insights for yourself, but we will, at some point there will be an opening of like, there is something. No, I would like to make that happen. Actually, I do want to become that person, or, I do want to create that change. And then we got something, but we can start the process without. Sometimes there isn't anything. And then for me as a professional, I'm like, well, I don't want to call this coaching, because I don't want that person to think that that's coaching. Really, we're just having conversations, and through those conversations, a lot emerges, which is very valuable. Clients generally don't really care, but I wonder what your perspective on that is, in terms of goals, agendas, what framework we put around this.
I think there is an expectation or a kind of unspoken rule that there is that future focus, or that striving towards something. But I think that the something that is towards can be really nebulous. And in some ways, it can be really helpful when it's more nebulous, because it's more realistic in some ways. That's not to say that there isn't a place for the kind of more concrete, smart style goals. That's definitely a thing, and particularly with autistic clients, that can really be a thing. Like even just in one session, it might be a very, very specific thing, and could be much more directive than with a neurotypical client. But I think most of us probably have some sense of a space within ourselves that we wish we could inhabit. Whether it's that we don't inhabit it at all yet, or whether it's because we just want to be there more, or we want to understand how we get ourselves into that space. And that to me is the really interesting stuff, just personally. That's just where I love to go with people. and that's never going to be concrete. Yeah. And it's going to shift because we're fluid. So there's something about being able to maintain that kind of shifting and that fogginess, and being okay with that. And there's still a sense of it driving forward and it having some kind of aim, but that aim is just a bit, it's fogged up.
It's fogged up. I know you like to work with metaphor and creativity, and your website is around the canvas metaphor. You know, working with a canvas, and in many ways your life is a canvas, you know. Sometimes there's different facticities in terms of, you know, I leave that at that. But I guess the question I had and why that came up at this particular point is, when somebody's painting on a canvas, whether that's, you know, yourself, viewing yourself as a canvas or the actual canvas for an artist, I know some artists, they will have a very clear vision of what they want to paint, and then they paint that, you know. Others, they just kind of start painting and then something emerges because it's impossible for something not to emerge. How do you work with that metaphor? Why did you choose that to be like an overarching theme for how you put yourself out there?
It's a really good question, and kind of forces me to look back to when I started, because I've kind of kept the same one for the whole time since I first set up my website. I haven't changed it, but actually probably the meaning behind it has shifted slightly. So when I started, I think it was because I was particularly interested in coaching people in creative ways. So my final dissertation was on creative inspiration, and I was interested in working with creative types around sort of creative dilemmas as a general client group. But also there was something around that work, as you say, with metaphor, imagery, dreams, that kind of stuff, which has that sort of artistic quality to it often. But it's also something around that notion of possibility. So the idea of the blank canvas. But to build on that slightly, I think there's something more there about the notion that we've all already started painting on those canvases, and we can't just erase that, start again. There's something about claiming our history and not trying to rewrite our entire narrative or just start a new damn narrative in the middle of our lives. But, you know, being able to run with that and own what our story is, but figure out what we're going to do with that next. So there's something about that, I guess, that sense of creation and interpretation of our lives. But can I
jump in with something?
Sure.
Because like that, I'm just imagining that there's a canvas and something's already been painted on it. I know there's school of thoughts, NLP, for example, I'm thinking about, that you just kind of paint over that. You know, you just kind of reprogram yourself, and on a canvas particularly, there's many like paintings that have been painted over, and underneath a couple of layers of paint, there might be something completely different. You just really can't perceive it. I think with the humans, it's a little bit more complex because often what's underneath is not just gone, it's still there.
Other people can't perceive it, but we know it's there. The artist knows it's there. The artist knows what came before. So we can cover things up from other people, but we know the whole story. And yeah, I think there's something really important about being able to claim all those bits of ourselves. I mean, it might be that we decide to take a very different path, and that some of that historical stuff is not necessarily as relevant, or it doesn't hold as much space within the story, but it's still a part of our story. And I think it's so important to be able to claim that, to own that, rather than trying to sort of fight against ourselves.
Yeah, and sometimes depending on what the surface is and what the paint is, the stuff from underneath will seep through. You know, if it's very thick paint, you will be able to see it when you look a little bit closer or from the side.
Know what? You never quite know when that's going to happen. So I think there's something to be said for being prepared for that, being able to own it so that it's not this horrible experience when that does happen.
Yeah, because I mean, as people, we only get one canvas, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I love that whole thing. And I also know you've been interested in narrative coaching. In one of your lectures at Animas, you've had a slide that unfortunately didn't have much time to get into, which had Morgan Freeman on it. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the narrative. Yeah, well, you can do that too. Maybe you had a really clever metaphor there, or maybe you know him. I'd love to. I'd love to have a
I
chat.
wish.
But what was the connection between Morgan Freeman and narrative? I mean, besides the obvious, I reckon there was something more. But like, what's the role that narrative plays for your existential work?
Yeah, so I think there's something about. Obviously, Morgan Freeman is kind of known for having that narrative role in films. So he'll often be the guy who does the voiceover that kind of elucidates plot or whatever. So he has that kind of cultural meaning. But I find it interesting how we all individually do that for ourselves. So what is that process of creating narrative? Do we hear something in our head that is like telling the story of our lives that is separate to us, or is it us telling that story? Like, how do we even conceive of that? Or do we think of it as a film? Do we think of it as a book? Do we think of it as a bloody horror story? Do you know what? There's so many different ways that the concept and the context of that, it can be different. And I'm really not even talking about the content of it, but just our notion of how we conceive of that narrative building, that telling of our story. And it's something that people often don't necessarily sit with that much, because it kind of goes on in the background without us thinking about it. And we kind of assume that it's the same process for everyone, but actually when you ask people about it and they really give it a chance to sit with it and think about it, maybe observe it for a week or so. Yeah. It's so interesting. It's just so different. And I think it reveals so much about how we relate to our own story, how we relate to our own narrative, which then says a lot about how we live and the choices that we make. So it all kind of feeds back into itself. It's all part of those kind of cogs that turn in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you work with that as a coach? Because I know there is a whole narrative approach to coaching and to psychotherapy. Some narrative coaches just start every session with, tell me your story, and then really encourage a client to really tell it as a story. I know there's lots of little kind of techniques or exercises that could help a client to then become aware and then re-author that story, and then this co-authoring together of moving forward with it. But it can also be just integrated. I mean, it's almost impossible for a client not to tell their story in some way or another. But I wondered if that's if you work with it in a specific way, or if elements of it just kind of surface in your work.
Yeah, I think it's the elements of it just kind of surface. So it's something that I will try to tune into in terms of what is the narrative that they are telling me about their life. So what is that kind of sense of their hero's journey, for example? But also then once I've got a sense of that, obviously checking it with them, and then thinking about how an awareness or a knowledge of that narrative sense of our lives can help us to make decisions going forward. So a lot of the time, the story that people will be telling will be a story of a problem or a dilemma, but they'll see that as something that is wrong, or that shouldn't be like that. That that often it will have a sort of fatalistic quality to it. So they'll read in all kinds of assumptions about what that means about them as a person. That they're defective in some way, or that they've made bad choices, or whatever meaning it is they're ascribing to that. But actually, narratively speaking, that is a really normal part of a story, right? You wouldn't watch a film or read a book where there's no damn challenge. It would be so boring. I mean, they do exist, but they're kind of experimental. Usually there's a challenge and the hero has to overcome that. They have to go through that. And in doing that, they kind of claim something about themselves. They learn something about themselves. And actually, when you kind of get people thinking about it in that way, so sometimes being quite explicit about that, or even getting them to think, if this was a film, what would the hero do next, or whatever. It just takes them back into that ownership of challenge, that ownership of a problem that they're facing, that it doesn't have to be something that defeats them. It's a part of their story. And the interesting part of the story is what they do with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where I really appreciate what existentialism brings, particularly to storytelling. Because I noticed that at some point while we were students, I'm like, oh my God, every one of my favorite stories, whether that's a song or a novel or a movie, has all of the existential dilemmas and themes. Mm-hmm. You know, there's somebody trying to make sense of something, trying to create meaning, fighting meaninglessness, trying to relate with other people, feeling maybe a bit alone with their position or who they are. There's often a life and death situation. Yeah. You know, there's this need to make a choice in the face of uncertainty.
Yes.
You know, so they're all there. They make for the stories that we tell. You know, the stories that are really popular. Yeah. And yet so many people are aspiring to live a life where they're just happy all the time. Yeah. You know, or the kind of ups and downs, they're well managed and under control. And it's that moments when we lose control or we're not quite sure whether we're going to make it, that life gets really exciting. You know, and we like to recreate that in safe environments.
Yes, exactly, like roller coasters and horror films and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, or just reading a book, you know, or like, but yeah, that's...
Yeah, you can tell what things I like to do in my free time, can't you?
Reading a horror book while on the roller coaster.
Awesome.
Yeah, but similar. I've noticed that in recent years, I've blew my knee out a couple of times, and then also had my year of where I got married just after the winter season, and then I just had lots of work at some season, and so I didn't go snowboarding so much anymore. And then when I did in certain seasons, I just felt I really wanted to be quite careful with what I'm doing so I wouldn't injure myself and be at my wedding on crutches, which wouldn't have been very impressive. But
in sickness and in health.
Yeah, she would have still killed me. But what I've noticed is that there is a proximity to death. When I go snowboarding in a particular way, you know, when you go free riding, when you go off the piste, and when, you know, nothing's ever 100% avalanche safe, and the best conditions to ride are, you know, powder as high as you can. So certain phases, like there are certain times when I just have to get that left turn because if not, I'm going to die. And the proximity to those kind of situations, they are somewhat controlled because, you know, I kind of know where my level is at and what I can and what I can't do. And I tend to ride within the bounds of what I can still control. But it does get so exciting when it becomes closer. And we are maybe not so certain right now whether this next thing is going to work out. Same with freestyle tricks in the park, or anybody who plays any kind of sport where, you know, it's kind of on the action extreme sport area, or even on a bike when you just try something new that you haven't done before and there's a chance you could fall off. At work, it's the same thing. You are on a project, or you try to sign up a client and you're really taking a risk. You're going out on Olympia, or you're asking somebody for a favor. You ask somebody out for a date. You know, you're not quite sure. You might not die, but actually if you're in a nightclub and you ask out the wrong girl or the wrong guy, well, with a guy, maybe it's not so common, but if you can ask out the wrong girl and get beaten up. And, you know, so there is this proximity to danger that seems to make life really, really exciting. And when I didn't have that for a couple of years, I really felt I was missing something. The quality of my life was lacking that proximity to physical death that made a real difference in my life. And that was super interesting. I needed a dose of death in my life. It's not that I needed it. I was still quite happy, but I noticed the difference in the quality, you know.
That's
and
really
I think
interesting.
And I think that's why the action sports, the adventure sports kind of holidays industry has been booming for some time, because people are looking for experiences that make their life exciting.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I don't do any of that extreme sports, but I like hearing about it. I just play Warcraft. I mean, that's how I encountered death.
But But it's a thing, like the death in video games. It's actually it can be an I'm not sure what the adjective is, but it can be a substitution for that real, like, because I noticed in my video game days, like many moons ago now, but really having my heart beat, very loudly. Absolutely. When I was about to die.
Yes. Yeah, and a real kind of spurt of adrenaline as well that can leave you quite on edge. Yeah.
And I mean, it got a bit nowadays. I mean, maybe that's, I'm not so much into video game industry so much anymore, but I said at some point I noticed how video games turned away from having to put some real work in to get back to that level where you died. Usually you'd kind of jump straight back into the game or you had a save point that was like 5 seconds earlier. And then you didn't really lose anything. I'm from a generation where there was games where you didn't save for hours, and then you had to recreate all of that, or you had to start the game from the very beginning, like in many of the very early games.
Absolutely.
Nowadays it seems to be different.
Runs out of batteries and you lose everything.
Yeah, you literally lost everything.
Yeah. I mean, there are a few that recreate that. So things like Dark Souls, which I haven't really played, which is kind of notoriously impossible because there isn't really any save game. You have to just basically play through, or there's hardly any save places.
With how long is the gameplay?
Oh God, I don't know. I can't be bothered with that.
Okay.
But yeah, I think there's obviously a kind of a thirst for that, a sense of wanting that level of challenge and that level of essentially death anxiety within the actual game.
Yeah. And if the simulation is good enough, I think you get the same response. And I think that's why it's going to be super interesting going forward with technology giving us experiences where it's difficult to decide whether this is real or not. Yeah. When we jump into a virtual reality and, give us another 20, 30 years, and I reckon we probably have simulations where we can't really tell whether we're still inside the game or not. And then it's going to be really interesting.
It is. Be careful I don't get sucked into that. I'm quite capable of it.
Yeah. But also it is an escape. And I think this is where it gets back to the coaching space very firmly for me, because there's a lot of people out there, or a lot of clients who, well, let's leave it as people, but they try to avoid their life right now. They'd rather do, the other life that seems to be more exciting. There is an escape into a world where we might not need to take so much risk, because if it does go wrong, we can always go back to the safe game, and try again.
Well, and sometimes the sort of achievement systems or whatever, the way that that you're doing well is so concrete, whereas in life it's so uncertain. There's not really a good sense of how you measure that stuff. I mean, you can measure it in various ways, but what does it really mean? And, a lot of the time people will spend many years measuring it in one particular way and then have a crisis when they realize that doesn't actually mean that much to them.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something safe there in terms of our efforts being counted towards something or knowing what the aim is.
Yeah, imagine you start a game and they tell you need to mine those resources, and then you spend 8 hours doing gameplay, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, exactly. That's what
now
the
go
game
do this
of
other
life
thing.
should be.
Yeah. Imagine a game that would educate us existentially by doing those kind of things. It's like, no, mind those other things. No, that didn't mean anything either. Now, well, you obviously had to make those decisions. I mean, we told you what to do and you did it, but obviously from the very beginning you had to make your own choices.
Yeah, it's all on you, buddy.
Tell me. But then some dickhead on YouTube would probably just spoil it for everybody and say, don't follow the instructions. You have to make choices from the very beginning.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's the age of walkthroughs and let's plays.
But then actually we do have walkthrough. I'm just thinking, I'm kind of the dick on YouTube who says, you need to make your own choices from the very beginning. And yes, there's lots of people who would tell you how to live life and what to do. But ultimately, It's not a walkthrough because I'm not telling you how to walk through, but I think there's some guidance that we can give.
But isn't that a really interesting concept as well, in terms of what you were mentioning earlier about sort of Instagram and YouTube stars or whatever, or this sense of looking up to people because we think that they're living in the way that we're supposed to live. It's kind of like they're doing walkthroughs or let's plays for life.
Yeah.
There is no walkthrough for life. It looks different for every one of us.
Well, there's plenty of them. It's difficult to be very concrete about it. They're not so easily discernible.
Mm-hmm. And they're kind of all equally valid as well, which...
Yeah, well, try to write a walkthrough for like every game ever. And it needs to be one. How do you write a walkthrough for like thousands of different games that have a lot in common, but they're all different? But that brings me to another question, because I sometimes, certainly in the beginning, I got really excited about existential philosophy and the existential ideas, and I guess the existential attitude towards navigating life. And I felt it was worthwhile putting my educator hat on every now and then and say, I think this is a really worthwhile way to navigate life. And as a coach, I want to be really careful with not telling my clients how to live life. I know many will have engaged with some of the content or, heard people like us or other kinds of existential coaches speak about these kind of things, maybe get some ideas from Sartre or Heidegger or Buber, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Camus or whoever, and say, I resonate with their approach to life and living. I'm interested in existential coaching. But more often than not, it's just coaching. And then sometimes I'm really tempted to say, look, there is no walkthrough. You're going to have to create your own walkthrough. But I don't want to be teaching it too much. I don't. They still kind of need to figure it out themselves. So how do you relate to that kind of that temptation to guide people or educate people or tell people about the existential attitude, and that maybe it's a worthwhile attitude to take on?
I think that's a really important point, and we all get tempted at various times to put on that educator hat when we shouldn't really be doing it. But I think it's something that can be, to a degree, that can be modeled in some way within the coaching dynamic. So it's not necessarily about interpreting what that might mean to that person in concrete terms, like how it might impact the way that they live, but just taking that existential attitude within the dialogue, within the relationship. So embodying that attitude as a practitioner, and then the client can choose what to do with that. Because there's something kind of unexistential about trying to foist it on someone anyway, right? Because that's
the whole point is questioning it and making your own choices, right?
Exactly. So I think it's just something about creating that existential space where we take that attitude towards things. So where we look at freedom, where we look at responsibility, where we think in more fluid terms, more ambiguous, paradoxical terms. It's just that kind of accepting existential space, and then what somebody does with that is going to vary greatly. And I think that people take from that what is important for that particular person to take from it. And it's the same with reading and interpreting the philosophy. What one person takes from it is not going to be the same as what another person takes from it. There's all sorts of different ways that we can view it and kind of make it our own. And it's the same with practitioners. What it means for you to be an existential coach is not going to be the same as what it means for me to be an existential coach, or what Phil, means to be an existential coach. It's just about having that environment, that outlook that makes it possible for us to then run with it in the direction that works for us.
Yeah, true. On that note, just reminds me, I wanted to ask you if you have a favorite quote, or because quotes are notoriously some of those, like people take from quotes whatever, like a good quote is something that isn't perhaps as clear as you think it is. Lots of people take from quotes different things. So I wonder if there's one or several that you feel are quite helpful, or that you perhaps have recited to a coaching client recently or something like that.
Well, I think the old he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how is a good one, which is a Nietzschean one. I think it just summarizes one of his key ideas very, very well, and it's easy to interpret. It's not sort of complex, highly falutin philosophical nonsense,
Yeah, and also people have often heard of it because Viktor Frankl also wrote it, picked it up from Nietzsche. So it's out there, and plus Simon Sinek then has taken some of those ideas as well, and created this whole body of work around why. I really like that trend in organizations, but also in people in general, to give a lot more of a shit about the why. Recognizing the powerful foundation that it provides. And it's at the heart of existential practice, logo practice, because it just creates a foundation that's incredibly strong.
Yeah. And I think that's what it boils down to for me, probably in terms of what it means to work existentially, that it is more about that why rather than necessarily the how. Like the how will come afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And often people want to leap straight to the how without understanding the why.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of that why space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's easy as a coach to want to jump on the how when, the goal seems to be clear. The next step for many coaches is, okay, how can we get there?
Yeah.
And taking that extra step to ask, what why is behind this goal is such an important one. Yeah. And on that note, I wondered if you had any kind of techniques or exercises, or how do you get to that why? I know there's a lot of ways how we can reveal it or explore it, but I wonder how you work with that as a coach.
I do tend to, well, I guess the image work thing is one big way in which I tend to do that, because when people bring up a metaphor or an image, or particularly if they have a dream that it's stuck with them and they want to work through, there are ways to explore that phenomenologically. Got it first time.
Hey.
That can really elucidate that sort of tacit knowledge that people have about what's going on for them. And it gets us out of that narrative that we've been telling again and again and again, and that isn't necessarily helpful because it's just basically a script that we're following rather than anything that's going to bring any insight or any shift. So working phenomenologically with those things, I find can be really, really powerful in terms of illuminating the why, or at least some things that are going on sort of underneath the surface. And I do tend to use the Four Worlds model in terms of just making sure that my explorations with people are even-handed. So working through how people are, well, what's going on a sort of physical, practical level, what's going on a social level, what's going on a personal kind of identity type level, and what's going on a meaning-making level, because people will kind of just view a dilemma or a goal on one of those levels. They'll be fixated on one of those particular paradigms. And actually, when you kind of explore other ways of looking at it, you can uncover all sorts of different motivations that they haven't really looked at, they haven't really understood, and they're all valid, they're all equal.
Yeah, and I really like that about the Four Worlds model that your mum invented it, right?
It was, Binswanger did the first three, and then Van Deurzen threw in the spiritual.
Yeah, and again, this is what the existentialists tend to, offer, that extra level of looking at the meaning behind things. What is the wider context of this? And And you mentioned phenomenological, and I know we both know what that means, but for somebody who's listening who might not have heard about that, I know it's difficult to put it in a nutshell. But what do you mean when you say phenomenologically exploring what there is?
Sure. So phenomenology is literally the science of phenomena. And so it's a way of looking at the world from a sort of subjective point of view. So not trying to do this kind of more scientific, mathematical, objective approach to things, but looking at the experience of individual consciousness.
Right. So not objective. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious here, but like not objective facts, but everybody's got their own truth kind of thing. Yeah.
So it's what it boils down to is a way of having a dialogue that tries to elucidate the sort of essence of what that person's experience is and to understand what is going on in that experience. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of really looking at how people are making sense of their worlds, their experiences, rather than trying to create some sort of framework or formula or theory about it.
Mm-hmm. But completely from within that client's frame of reference.
Exactly.
Bracketing everything that we think we know about this. And that can be so... Yeah.
Sorry,
I know we both get excited about phenomenological interaction, but like I think it's so important because we're pretty nerdy. But I think it's so important because when I see coaches, and I've trained like I don't know hundreds, maybe thousands by now, the one thing that the largest number of them struggle with is to let go of their own perspective of what's true or not, to really tune in with a client, not making assumptions about what that means, what they're telling you. Yeah. And I mean, the extreme example is not an extreme example, but how are you? Good. You don't have a clue what that means. You want to explore that. But if somebody says it's quite hot in here, you still don't really know what that means.
Yeah.
But like, where do you stop exploring? Some things we need to have a shared reference for, and we cannot inquire. Like, we cannot say hello, and you say hello. What do you mean? What are you saying?
True. Although working with autistic clients can be a little bit like that sometimes, because they're trying to decode neurotypical behavior, sort of neurotypical scripts that they don't share.
Tell us a bit more about that, because that's on my list as well. How do you work with that? How is that different?
Yeah, well, I think the wonderful thing about it is that autistic people, and I'm using identity first language here deliberately, so autistic people rather than people with autism, tend to be pretty damn straightforward about stuff. So in general, they're just so unmanipulative. It's wonderful. It's like, what you're dealing with. It's very concrete, and that can come across as rude in a sort of neurotypical paradigm. But actually, it's just very no nonsense.
Not in a German paradigm.
Gosh, autistic Germans must be quite something. But there is something around really having to create that space for people to explore all of those frustrations about living in a world that is just not designed for you. It's all follows these quite mysterious scripts that even when you understand them, they just don't make sense, because why are people not being as straightforward as me, kind of thing? What's the point of it? So there's a lot on a practical level about sort of fitting into that paradigm and how to navigate social interactions that, again, can be quite directive, like literally, what do I say? Or what does it mean when somebody says this? Or somebody reacted to what I said in this particular way and their face looked like this. What does that mean? But then also that really philosophical space of being in that place of not understanding and being othered, and having to put in a hell of a lot of energy to understand society or other people, that it is not energy that people put back into understanding the autistic brain.
So how do you manage the educational desire, like the desire to be educated about how things work and provide meaning for them when you may just have it, and like facilitating a process of making sense of this?
So sometimes it will literally be that you've just got to give a straightforward answer. If you know what's good, well, I say that I'm not necessarily always the best at knowing that, because, hey, I'm autistic myself, right? So although I've learned a few things in my time, I don't always have it sussed anyway. And I think it's dangerous to just assume that we have it sussed, because people are so mysterious. We don't even, whether you're neurodiverse or neurotypical, like half the time we don't know what the hell people are doing and what their behavior means. But it can be helpful sometimes to just say, well, the likelihood is that is indicating such and such, or when most people make that expression, it's an indication of this particular emotion or whatever. But always with that caveat, that transparency of that people are complex, and so it may be that that's what they're showing you, but it might not necessarily mean that to them. So actually, I think this phenomenological attitude, this attitude of subjectivity rather than objectivity, is really useful, because they're trying to pin it down and make rules out of it. And actually a lot of the work is, well, you can get some kind of vague guideline rules about human behavior, but really people are just bloody confusing. And you're kind of right to be confused. Like, a lot of it is that, I think, normalizing that experience of being confused by people, that actually you're kind of the one who's got it right in some ways, that people are confusing. Yeah,
I would think that takes quite some careful contracting in the beginning of the coaching relationship, in terms of to what extent am I going to answer your questions straight as you ask them, and to what extent am I going to help you to make sense of this yourself, because there's a complexity in the world that might not have clear answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I guess that's the same with any client. Because I'm thinking that there's a lot of coaches out there who do want to, they're being asked straight questions by their clients, and they do want to help their clients make sense of things, adopting a position of knowing, certain things we do know, especially when we're, for example, working with a particular niche, and we've been working with that niche for quite some time, or we are that niche, and we just know how things work around here. There is this, there is this presumption that we know things, and sometimes it can be so helpful to just, put some of that knowledge on the table and say, what do you think? I'm not saying that that's always true, and it's true in your case. I'm saying that's been true for me most of the time, or for my clients most of the time. What do you think?
Yeah, I think those kinds of things are really difficult to negotiate, because it's very hard to actually qualify when you make certain decisions and when you make other decisions, and what it is that's actually informing that choice. But I do think there's something to be said for, if something literally is that damn straightforward, then why completely overcomplicate it? And I think particularly with autistic clients, that's really important, because there's so much about trust and understanding that kind of concrete way of thinking, that if you're dancing around stuff all the time, they ain't going to damn well trust you. Yeah. Because you just look like you're manipulating and you're, hiding something.
Yeah. So you need to be really straightforward.
You just got to be really open.
Yeah. I like that.
I love it.
I think coaches should generally do that.
I think so too. I think, obviously you have to be careful about how you do that and what purpose it serves and what's informing it. But I think it's entirely appropriate sometimes.
I think it's always such an elegant way to come from your own experience. And I think that's something I really like about generally about existential coaches. They seem to be very direct. And when you used to hear it now and what's going on for you. For example, I had a client who like there was a party, he said, I like that guidance I like the guidance coaching. I like to be guided more. I'd like to be taken by the hand a bit more. or like today I really liked when you threw this or this or this on the table. I'd love to have a lot more of that. And it was difficult because I could see why, and it would be easier for me in a way because I did want to offer a lot more as well. But just being open and honest about it is like, look, I would actually like to put a lot more of that in, but I find myself being quite hesitant to agree to that because here are my thoughts, and I think then you're in real partnership.
Exactly.
You're putting something out that's going on for you and that person reacts to it. And then together you create an agreement of how you're going to move forward with this.
Absolutely. I think that's really important, that level of transparency. And I think when people talk about transparency, often they kind of mean something a bit different. Like they mean not actually expressing all of that nuance and all of that uncertainty in it. They kind of mean just saying something quite abrupt, not necessarily that helpful. So the transparency, I think, is with the caveat of you are being transparent about all of those different processes that are going on at the same time, rather than just this kind of hard line attitude.
Yeah.
The other thing I think in terms of working with autistic clients is quite often they don't know where the boundaries are because they're not following that same they don't necessarily know what the conventions are. And so it's really important to be able to say, like, for them to be able to ask direct questions or whatever, and then for you to be able to say, I will let you know where the boundary is. I will let you know if something is making me uncomfortable or if that's not appropriate, or you just have to be like really out there and transparent with everything. It's like, don't assume that there's this unspoken rule because it probably isn't there.
Right. That's really, really helpful. Is there any other kind of tips or advice? Like what the question I was thinking about earlier is, I've had a few clients who mentioned that they have some suspicion that they might be on the spectrum, or maybe somebody's given them that feedback and now they kind of start to question a little bit. And I wonder, for the coaches who might be listening to this or watching this, who have a client where they have some suspicions that they might be on the spectrum, what advice would you give them? How can you proceed if there's anything you need to do other than to just coach them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is that transparency and that not assuming that they're going to be kind of following the same basic social script as you. And that includes like probably steering away from things like sarcasm, because there's a tendency to take things literally, to not understand, like unless you make it really clear that you're making a joke or whatever. People can get really hurt by that because they literally don't understand that it's a joke.
Yeah. Sarcasm, I think, generally needs to be used with caution in coaching.
Definitely. It's a very British context as well. I mean, I would steer away from using sarcasm with anybody who isn't just like really super British, because it doesn't necessarily translate that well. Like in general, not just in a coaching situation. There's also things to keep in mind in terms of potential sensory issues. So maybe checking in with things like the lighting level, for example. Just checking in with anything on a sensory level that might be causing them distress, because autistic people tend to get sensory overwhelm, so they'll be very, very sensitive to particular sensory inputs. So that's a good one to kind of just check in with, if there's any way that you can kind of make the experience more comfortable, basically. What else? I mean, I think I would encourage anybody who is working with autistic people really to do a bit of research, because it is a very different paradigm. It's a really, really different paradigm. And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings that can happen between neurodiverse and neurotypical people, that there isn't really any kind of quick fix for. It really takes a lot of knowledge and understanding of the autistic kind of worldview, I suppose. Not to generalize. I mean, everybody has their own worldview. It's not like it's like one autistic paradigm. But yeah, I think you have to do your research with that one. It's so complex. And understanding as well that it is called a spectrum disorder for a reason. Like one autistic client is going to have a whole separate kind of spread of autistic traits to another autistic client. So it's not, we tend to stereotype and sort of think all autistic people are like Sheldon Cooper or whatever. They're not. And also, I think this, as part of that, the kind of stereotypes around autism and things like empathy, it doesn't necessarily mean that people have no sense of empathy, or that people, because they're not expressing emotion, it doesn't mean they're not feeling emotion. It's just a different way of communicating things. Often it's actually that they're so emotionally overwhelmed and they don't know how to express any of the emotion. There's a theory around autism which is called the intense world theory, which I think is a pretty good a theory as we're going to get anytime soon. It's basically that we experience everything around us is very intense. So that's where you get the sensory issues. That's where you get issues about interpreting people's behavior. That's where you get issues around expression of emotion, or not being able to express emotion, but also then on the extreme having meltdowns, etc. So yeah, a bit of an info dump there, which is an autistic thing.
Yeah, no, this is great, because I think it's important for coaches to have some understanding of where a certain spectrum begins. There's, I guess the question I would have is there a line somewhere, between, because coaching is supposed to be with normal people, and resourceful and whole, and autistic people can be very resourceful and whole, absolutely. But there is something that got us to give you a different name, so there's a threshold somewhere. So one of the things is I'm wondering where might be such a line from, for example, coaching an autistic person to whether they might need some therapy, or where's the line between do I need extra training? Do I need that understanding to coach somebody?
I do think people could, benefit from extra training in order really to work with autistic people in a meaningful way. In terms of the line between therapy and coaching, actually, I think this is part of the reason why we started doing this. I say we because we've kind of set up an autism coaching service specifically. And it's something that my colleague and I are going to be writing about and delivering quite a lot of training on, is because the coaching context is much more suitable in many ways to autistic clients. Because sitting in that therapeutic space and, for example, asking an autistic person about how they feel, many of them are not going to be able to answer that in any kind of straightforward way. Like, it's not, you can't kind of play the same games. It just, the whole context of it doesn't necessarily translate that well to an autistic brain. And
therapists are not super known for giving straight up answers.
No, exactly. So you kind of need that concreteness and that ability to be a bit more directive and a bit more upfront, which therapy doesn't really afford that well.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Well, how much time do you have? I don't think I've asked you properly. I know we have some time blocked, but I just wanted to check in with you because I have a few other things I'd love to talk about with you.
I've got time.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. This one. I wanted to ask you existentialism in terms of its philosophy and. I think coaching as well as an industry, I found, I just recently been getting this coaching course together, and it was really difficult to find diverse, BAME, minority, ethnic coaches. And I think existentialism seems to have a similar issue around it. You know, it's been difficult to find world-renowned, like your Sartres, your Camus, your Kierkegaards, Heideggers. They're all white men. There's a few women, notably. But like, why has this not spread out when it's so universal?
I think it is, I mean, you could say the same about social class as well. They're all particular social class. And I think it's really this issue of when you're looking at the proto-existentialists, so the real philosophers rather than practitioners, you are talking about history that has always been written by straight, cisgender, white men of a certain class. And it's very, very difficult for other people to have gotten in at those particular times, still now, but at those particular times, even more so.
But there's got to be contemporary thinkers, you know, I'm thinking.
Oh, yeah. And there are. Oh, you're back.
Yes,
Yay.
I lost you. I think you lost me. It says my internet connection is unstable. Last thing I've heard was, well, they are.
There are. I think when you look at people who are sort of coming through, graduating from existential programs, there is diversity in terms of ethnicity, in terms of class, in terms of religion, in terms of gender. It's there. But I think what happens is people are less likely to put themselves out there, possibly when they're in a minority group of some form. And actually, I don't like using minority, actually marginalized, because women are not a minority.
Certainly not. Yeah, minority is ridiculous.
Yeah. So I think it's harder sometimes for marginalized people to, well, we have to fight more boundaries in order to be heard. And that means that we have to be willing to put up a certain amount of fight to do that. So I think there's something about how much you're willing to put up with in order to put your voice out there. And I can understand why many people just choose not to have that particular struggle. But also you're less likely to become particularly known and shared around in the same way, you know. And there's a few thinkers. Obviously Simone de Beauvoir is a good example of not just a woman, but a queer person who is well known from a much earlier age, and a lot of her philosophy was informed by that sense of otherness as a woman. And the same with Frantz Fanon, who was a black man who was another existential thinker, a similar era, and a lot of his work was about being othered because of the colour of his skin. So it's out there, but I think it's harder to find, and it's harder to get people interested in, because a lot of the time the thinking comes from that particular paradigm. So a lot of people, I remember speaking at Philosophy Now conference ages ago. And the people who were there obviously were all subscribing to Philosophy Now. They all knew about philosophers. And so many people just hadn't heard of Simone de Beauvoir, but they all knew who Sartre was. So there's just something about that awareness.
That's interesting. And they were so close.
Yeah, exactly. You know. But I think unless you've kind of taken an interest, I think one of the problems that happens is that when people write about diversity, it's often only diverse groups that are interested in reading it. And that's kind of besides the point. We should all be reading about diverse groups that we don't fit into.
Yeah.
But who does it? I mean, I've made a conscious effort recently because of Black Lives Matter to read up more and more. And also I kind of have an advantage because that's my dad's field in philosophy. But, you know, we have to identify what our gaps are. Yeah. And work really hard to sort those out. And I think it's a challenge for us even sometimes to admit that we have those gaps. Yeah.
Yeah, if anybody listening to this is one of those groups that we talked about, do get in touch. If you know any reading, any people who are conceptualizing this or taking existential thought further or applying that, to whatever experience there is, I would love to hear about it. And I think particularly in existentialism, so interesting because the philosophy, I have a feeling, will not necessarily change because it's about human. It's about, stripping all these layers that might make a group away, and just looking at the raw, bare bones of existence. And by definition, they're the same for every human being on the planet. That's why I like it's a philosophy that's diverse in the essence.
Absolutely.
Talked about that. Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you about your book, because I heard somewhere that you've got a book deal for a self-help book, and I got curious, so I figured I'd ask you.
Yeah, I signed a book deal with Routledge for a book that is essentially a kind of be your own existential coach book. So a sort of practical philosophy for the big questions, I think is the subtitle I put on there. But we'll see, those things can change. But yeah, I really wanted to write something that emphasizes how practical these philosophies actually are and how sort of universal and relatable they are, rather than the kind of gatekeeping that I think happens sometimes, particularly with philosophy, but in all areas of academia. So practitioners can use it as a handbook in terms of working with clients, and trainees can use it to sort of think about how we translate theory into practice. But really, it's a self-help title.
Cool. I'm looking forward to that. When is it going to come out, or can people already pre-order?
Well, no, I've got to write the damn thing first. But it should, if I keep on schedule, it should come out at some point in 2021, probably in the autumn.
Cool. When I had a draft of my book together, I've had an interesting exchange with Ernesto Spinelli, who was one of the very early existential coaches, and he gave me some feedback around the school of existentialism that we're both from and where we trained, being quite focused on the individual. And I took that to heart, and I think it's true. And I since then kind of made an effort to be much more aware of our relationships with the world at large and with other people. But I had to recognize that certainly through our training, or through, it's not just our training, but through what I made of the training, I think I had an overly focus on the individual. I just wondered what your thoughts were around that, if you had a similar experience with that, or to what extent you see that as relational or individualistic, because it can get a reputation of being quite individualistic as a philosophy.
I think the individualism is a mark of the time in which a lot of those proto-existentialists were writing. So if we had existential thinkers, more explicitly existential thinkers pre-Renaissance, you would get a very different view. But post-Renaissance, you're talking about individualistic attitudes, and certainly the way that culture has gone predominantly has gotten more and more individualistic. That's kind of a fact of the culture that we live in. I remember though, during our training, kind of commenting on this, and I think I turned it into a gendered thing at the time, which I now think is wrong. I take it back. But it was something that I had noted, that a lot of it is a lot of the philosophy is quite individualistic and quite kind of, it doesn't talk about relationships in a sort of, how to put this? I guess there's the kind of ecosystem that perhaps I see them as. But I do think that's something about the philosophy, rather than necessarily a particular school of thought or a particular interpretation. And I think it's up to each of us to think about how these things can apply, or how we make sense of these things in perhaps that more connected way. And I think also there is something about the fact that at that time it was almost a sort of, that individualism was a push back against something, I think. And I think now things have gone the opposite direction and the pushback is more about community, or needs to be more about community.
Yeah, I've been exploring the notion of existential dialogue with Monica Hennaway, and we started looking what's out there. And I found an institute for existential dialogue in Japan. I'm still waiting to have a conversation with a guy. We got in touch on LinkedIn. The world's a beautiful place in that way. There's one in Mexico as well. They practice existential dialogue. And I thought that was really interesting because Japan very much so, and Mexico a lot more than here, are much more collectivist cultures. You know, they have a much higher regard for, you know, the communities and the societies and the relationships between people. And I wonder what happens with existential thought once it gets, you know, developed and taken up in Japan and put into a center. I'm so curious.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of kind of movement towards existential thinking in India, I've noticed. So that's a sort of interesting cultural paradigm on that as well. So I think it's always interesting when you take these things out of that kind of European context, which always has a particular cultural understanding to it. So I think that's really important anyway, just to do with anything, that we don't kind of just think of it through that sort of Western or particularly European lens, that we take it outside of that context. Because, you know, the whole point is that we were saying we like about it is that it's so inclusive and it's so diverse and accepting of that. And yet a lot of the time when we talk about it, we're talking from a very European understanding of it.
Yeah.
I'm aware of some thinkers in various different parts of the world that have quite different contexts. I've been talking to a group of South African coaches recently about existential work, which has been really interesting, and sort of getting to know, you know, that kind of paradigm or that kind of interpretation of it, how different cultures make sense of it, or what is seen as more important in there, or how it kind of feeds into that cultural narrative. It's fascinating.
I was about to mention South Africa because it's where I get feedback on the book from most frequently.
Oh, really?
Like there's at least a handful of South African coaches. And also,
apparently coaching is, with South Africa is one of the countries where coaching is the biggest industry.
Huh. Yeah, I know Peter Hawkins did a lot of work there. Jonathan Passmore told me he's done South Africa quite a bit. Yes.
South Africa and Australia, I understand, are two of the biggest sort of centres for coaching as an industry.
Okay, so then maybe it's not so much the existentialism, maybe it's just that's coaching.
yeah, could be.
but also I was delighted, like during the pandemic at some point I decided to offer my introductory weekend for, you know, like a fraction of the price, just because I felt, given the existential concerns around, you know, isolation and death and meaninglessness and how we relate to other people, seemed so relevant as people were in lockdown. And so it was the first time I've delivered it online. And I've had people from all over the world. So there's clearly a hunger for existential themes, you know,
Definitely.
and it helps people. So I think it's so useful to have that out there. And it's delightful to see the interest all over the world, even though it's still a very young and growing field.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, you know, post-COVID is going to be an interesting time. Well, post-COVID, I mean...
Yeah, I know.
Whatever that means, but whenever that happens. But, you know, we've all been faced in quite an acute way with lots of existential issues, the death anxiety being the obvious one, but also things around isolation, meaning, freedom. These have been really big themes that kind of the whole world has experienced together. So I think it's a real good time for people to be speaking about these ideas in a way that is helpful, practical to people.
I just realized that BC could also stand for before COVID.
Yes.
Cool. Hey, Sasha, I've got a few questions left that I tend to ask all of the coaches on the podcast, and sometimes they morph a little bit, sometimes I add something, but I do want to ask a similar set of questions to everybody. So do answer these as short or long as you want. Mm-hmm. One is, do you think the coaching profession should be regulated?
Yes. It's the very short, succinct answer. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think it's irresponsible for it not to be.
Thank you, first of all. I don't think I've ever gotten a straight answer like that.
Cool. That's the autistic thing.
Yeah. I guess I would want to play devil's advocate and say, well, if I'm somebody who genuinely helps people, but I don't have your fancy, very expensive degrees and qualifications, or the extra couple of grand that it would take to do ICF accredited training and, get on board on a professional body, like how would that look like so the people that help people would still be able to help people?
Yeah, well, I think psychotherapy went through this kind of crisis 30 years ago when the professional bodies were set up, although it's still not a protected title as such, and I think there is a question that we all have to answer around making qualifications more accessible to people generally. So whether that's a coaching context or any other professional accreditation, mm-hmm. I think we have a responsibility, those of us who are in that field already or who have the means, to set up systems where we can give people a bit of a helping start, because otherwise you end up in a situation where the only people who are holding that role are people who have a certain amount of money, a certain amount of education early on. We've got to make things more accessible for people. It's ridiculous. We can't have a profession that is completely led by, middle-class fools like myself. It doesn't work. We need diversity within that.
But isn't regulation working against that rather than for it?
Well, on a basic level, yes, but I think you have to also protect the general public. And although we would all like to think that we're doing a fantastic job and that there's nothing unethical going on, I know from experiences, and you will know from experiences and anecdotes and people who are practicing, and it's a very dangerous thing when people are out there working with potentially vulnerable people who perhaps should be in therapy, but a coach who doesn't have good training and good ethical knowledge may not refer them. They may work with them as a very vulnerable person, and you can do a lot of damage that way. Mm-hmm. So I think it's essential that we regulate in order to protect people. But I also think it's essential that across the board we make things more accessible to people, and that we encourage talent. And by talent in the coaching context, I mean people who have a great deal of empathy, people who have that kind of one-to-one skill.
Yeah, thank you. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure we could talk for an hour or two about regulation. That's good. What are some of the books or people, one or several, feel free, that had a significant impact on particularly your coaching work?
Well, I do think Man's Search for Meaning is definitely one of those, and it's something that I would recommend that anybody reads, really. You don't have to even be in the industry for it to have an impact on you. Mm-hmm.
Viktor Frankl, just
yes.
If somebody hasn't heard the name, or for some reason it doesn't come up when you Google Man's Search for Meaning.
I think also I have to... Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, I think, had a big impact on me. I couldn't even necessarily exactly tell you why or how, but it holds a sort of special place in my heart. And then there are some more books that are kind of not necessarily on the philosophical end. So Paul Gilbert's The Compassionate Mind was useful to me as a person and as a practitioner in terms of being more compassionate towards myself, and also thinking about self-compassion generally in terms of a skill that's important, I think, for all of us to develop, and something that we don't necessarily talk about that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and developing that towards generally, to ourselves, but also to other people. I think when we learn to be compassionate about ourselves, it's so much easier to exist in the coaching space. Because how often do I see people like coaches beating themselves up for not having asked the more powerful question, or staying silent when on reflection maybe they wouldn't have wanted to stay silent, or the other way around, or saying the wrong thing, or not delivering the best intervention.
Exactly.
It changes a lot.
You've got to have it totally sussed all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned that self-talk. Great. Do you see any future trends in coaching or in existential coaching in particular that you think are interesting, or something that you see happening at the moment or leading towards it?
I think people are getting more interested in existential work generally, whether it's in a coaching paradigm or a therapeutic one, or just in terms of doing reading around stuff. And I think that is probably because of the things that we discussed before about the kind of state of the world, that people are finding that they need something a bit more meaty in terms of meaning making and understanding their experiences as humans in this world. But also I think that, as you were saying, that kind of kickback, that we're always kind of kicking back at whatever the predominant culture has been. It gets put in place for a bit and then we kind of push back and rebel, and then inevitably we go too far in the other direction and we have to correct it again. And I think that is happening on an existential level in terms of the thought that we've kind of been quite, I don't necessarily like the word superficial because it sounds really judgy. But I guess, to be honest, I am kind of judging. With the Instagram society, et cetera, and everything that our technological advancements have afforded us, the kind of dark side of that is this sense of isolation and a kind of blurred view of what it is to be human or how we should be living. Mm-hmm. So I think people are kind of getting interested in these kinds of ideas as a kickback to that culture.
Yeah, I think especially in this increasingly VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, it just screams existential all over it. And I think people will have to reconsider what it means to be human as we move into an age that is going to be characterized by artificial intelligence. So yeah, interesting times ahead, indeed.
Definitely.
And I've said that before. I think the existential coaching approach particularly focused so much on what it means to be human. Yeah. I cannot see it go anywhere but up, up as in increasingly in demand. Without breaking confidentiality, obviously, can you tell us about your most memorable client, or a memorable client, regardless of what you make out of that?
I tell you what, my most memorable story is actually from somebody who didn't end up being a client, but was a potential client. Does that count?
Yeah, that counts.
Okay, cool.
You met him in the coaching room, though?
No, only on the phone.
Right.
And I think you know this one, so apologies to you, but somebody gave me a call and I was commuting at the time, so it was kind of awkward, but I was getting off the train and he... immediately it felt weird because he was saying things like, there's a particular kind of coaching that I want, and I don't know if it's something that you could offer, but I'm willing to pay you double. And I thought, okay, this
sounds okay.
Already feeling suspect. I'm pretty much not going to do it, but tell me. And he wouldn't even tell me on the phone what it was. He said, what I'll do is I'll send you to a website of somebody in LA who is doing this particular type of coaching, and have a look and get back to me and let me know if it's something that you'd be able to do. So I said, okay. And then immediately it became clear because he gave me the URL, and it was www.strictjane.com.
That's not obvious to me.
Oh, okay. Maybe I just
have some
mind.
assumptions.
So I went to the website and I found out that Strict Jane is a certified life coach and dominatrix in LA. And, good on her.
Talking about power dynamics.
Well, yes. So she had this gallery of implements that she would use on you if you didn't do your coaching homework, that kind of thing. Which I thought wonderful and great for her, but yeah, not something that I'm going to be doing. So I had to write back to him. I just text him and, to let him down on that one. But my first reply, which I edited, was, I can't do that because I follow a strict ethical code. And I thought, no, delete strict.
Yeah, you might have been more attracted to it.
But yes, for somebody who I never actually coached, he is someone who I think of very, very often. And I wonder whether he ever found his strict Jane.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you got to admire the range of what life coaching can be, or how it's been interpreted by people.
Yeah. And hey, let's be sex positive and kink positive. That's cool for people who want it, but I ain't going to be the person to deliver it.
Yeah, fair play. Cool. I've got one more. Oh, no, actually, I got two more. Have you ever had to stop working with a client?
I have had situations where we have come to a crossroads about what the best direction is, and where I have essentially given them a choice between continuing coaching or referring them to somebody as a therapist, because there's clearly a lot of emotional content that is linked to something that they might want to do that kind of deep dive into. So some sort of unresolved stuff that they keep coming back to that's causing them a lot of pain, that they just haven't done the work on yet. And there's a feeling that might be what they're actually after. But I've always given them a choice. I've always said, look, this is what coaching would look like if we continue. But this is what therapy would look like if you chose to go that route. And the choice is yours, but it's going to be different. So I'm not going to sit there and do that work with you. And it's up to you where you want to go from there. And I think that's generally, I think the two times that I've had to do that, they've opted for therapy. And I think that probably was the right decision for them.
Cool. Thank you. And lastly, if you could take over the screen of a person or group of people, including the whole world, and have their undivided attention for a minute, what would your message be?
God, do you know what? I reckon this depends so much on my mood. But right now, I'm feeling like I would want to tell the whole world to just be a bit more accepting of nuance. I think there is something in us that is always there, but I think particularly recently, there is this sense of you must be kind of extreme in your beliefs or very rigid in your beliefs. We have stopped talking to each other because of this. We can't have sensible, nuanced dialogue about stuff. You're seen as with or against. And I think it goes back to that sense of self as well. That's that sense of ambiguity and paradox and acceptance of all of that. So it would be something around, nuance is a good thing. Let's always look at nuance. But nobody would listen.
Well, they do in my example. They cannot not listen. But what they do with it is another story. Yeah. Thank you, Sasha, so much for taking the time. Where can people find you or more of your work, or any projects you want to promote, and how do people get in touch with you?
Sure. So there's my personal coaching website, which is sashasmithcoaching.com. So you can get in contact with me there. You can also get in contact with me in an academic context through the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling. If you're interested in studying existential coaching, that's a great place to go, but also to have any kind of academic discussions that you want to have. The only other account I have is not coaching related. It is for my drag act.
I did not know about that one.
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
So
I mean, not the drag act, but where we find it.
My drag character is on Instagram. His name is Manny Shambles, because obviously you've got to have puns if you're a drag artist. So yes, you can see my more absurd side there. Awesome.
That is lovely. Anything else you want to tell these people about?
I don't know. Watch this space for my book and for stuff around neurodiversity, and we'll be doing lots of trainings on working with neurodiverse clients, and lots of autism positive stuff for autistic people as well to access. So definitely that's the next push of stuff that I'll be doing in a sort of CPD context. So if you're interested in that, definitely get in touch.
Cool. Sasha, thank you so much for being with us and being with me talking about coaching. I'm sure we'll continue to talk about coaching. And thank you for all of your work in the existential coaching space. I obviously really appreciate it. And let's grow this. Let's continue to grow this.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Thank you so much.